Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for another dispatch from the Frontlines. This is an ongoing series from the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. My name is Liz Watson, and I am the Executive Director of the Center, and I'm so pleased to have you here with us tonight. Each week, we hear from people whose lives have been upended by this pandemic, and we discuss the policy decisions being made, or dare I say, in some cases, delayed in Washington that are affecting all of our lives. We hear from our movement partners organizing for change, and we are often lucky to be joined by special guest members of Congress who are working on the relief policies under discussion. For those of you tuning in for the first time, the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center is a nonprofit organization that works to inform the public about policies that promote justice, equity, and fairness. So tonight, this dispatch is especially near and dear to my heart. My kids are 10 and 13, and if I am unlucky, you may see them make an appearance on the Zoom tonight. And I will tell you that my parent text chains are lighting up day and night with a string of worries from all of my friends about what we are going to do in the fall, how we are going to conduct online school for 6 hours a day and do our jobs and the rest of it. Yesterday, the sample schedule came out from the county where I live, and sort of shockwaves went through the neighborhood. And the emoji my friend sent me, you know, the smiley face emoji that's not smiling and it's gushing tears instead. I thought that sort of summed up where everyone is, right? But this is what we need to do in a pandemic to keep our children safe and to keep our educators safe. There are no great answers at the moment. And I know that my family and our neighbors are better off than so many others. You know, the problems that we're talking about are really small potatoes in comparison to what millions of parents are facing who can't work from home, especially those in low-wage jobs who are disproportionately Black and brown workers and disproportionately women and women of color, and so many families who've lost their jobs. There are millions who don't have reliable internet access, safe housing, or an income to rely on. So it's an understatement to say that our childcare system and our education system have been thrown into crisis by this pandemic. So this past spring, millions of educators followed health official advice. They turned on a dime. I was floored by our teachers' response when the schools closed. You know, we're in the midst of a pandemic that had all of us struggling. And yet these teachers, with no notice whatsoever, created an online learning program in just a few short weeks. It was nothing short of heroic. But the existing inequities in our education system and the policy failures of our administration in response to this pandemic have made it incredibly difficult for many children to truly benefit from online learning. Millions of students from big cities to tribal nations don't have access to high-speed internet or a laptop to log on to classes at home. Overcrowded classrooms and underfunded districts present major health risks, especially for Black and brown students. And of course, many students who may have IEPs, individualized education plans, and need accommodations under the law are struggling to get them in this crisis. There are millions of essential workers who don't have anyone to watch their children while they're working to put food on the table and keep the economy afloat. So simply put, our current administration has thus far failed to meet the needs of families and students across the United States and failed to meet the needs of our educators. We have educators who are in fear for their lives because they don't have the proper funding for the necessary protective equipment. We have to worry that children might carry the virus back to grandparents and parents at home. And there's simply is no plan that we're hearing from our administration to keep the people we love safe, support our educators, and support our kids in their learning. So with mounting cases in cities and states across the country, in so many places, it's simply infeasible for children to go back to physical school right now without jeopardizing their health, their parents' health, or the health of educators in our community. But in my home state, where I'm from, Indiana, on the very first day of school, where they did send kids back, The first day of school, they learned that a child who had attended all day uh, had COVID, and they had to figure out what to do. And a whole swirl of questions immediately were raised about whether that school needed to immediately shut back down. Because of failures, and that's just one example, and I will probably see that in more schools across the country. So, because of failures of leadership that we're seeing from our administration, we are facing a massive, massive public health crisis unfolding, frankly, with no current end in sight. We need to follow guidance from our public health experts, listen to our teachers, and let the facts guide our reopening plans. Tonight, we're lucky to be joined by an incredible group of special guests. We have parents, we have educators, we have policy experts, we have one of our education champions in Congress. Please join me in welcoming Representative Bonamici of Oregon, Congresswoman Bonamici of Oregon, President Lily Eskelen Garcia of the National Education Association, John King, the President and CEO of the Education Trust, and Beatriz Beckford, the National Director at Moms Rising. What a stellar group of speakers we have here tonight. We are really lucky to have you all join us. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us here tonight. And to all of you who've joined us in the audience on the phone, thank you for being here with us. We know for you parents, these are hectic times, and we really appreciate your chiming in to see what you can do to help and to lend your voice to this conversation. So now it is my honor to introduce our special congressional guest speaker tonight, Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. Congresswoman Bonamici represents the 1st Congressional District of Oregon. She is a leader on the Education and Labor Committee, and I was lucky to get to work with her when I was a staffer on that committee, and I know what a champion she is for our students and our educators. And she is the chair of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services. She has long been an advocate for equity in education policy and for funding. Congresswoman Bonamici is a strong champion in Congress who fights for rebuilding our crumbling school infrastructure and investing the billions of dollars that we truly need to ensure that our schools can reopen safely and that our educators and our kids can be safe. So, Congresswoman Bonamici, first, thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to see you, and thank you for joining tonight.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you to the center. It's an honor to be here with such esteemed guests tonight for this really important conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to your insight and hearing about the work that you're doing in Congress. So we know we're seeing across the country, a patchwork of decisions on reopening being made. I just described what's happening in my home state versus in the state where I live right now. We're seeing everything from full person instruction to fully virtual instruction. What should Congress do to make sure that every school and every school district has a safe and equitable return to instruction?
Well, thank you, Liz. That's a really important issue. And I want to start by saying that, our public schools were already facing significant challenges in Oregon and across the country before the coronavirus pandemic, with lack of funding. You mentioned the crumbling infrastructure, large class sizes, and the pandemic has exacerbated so many of those inequities we've seen with technology and lack of access. And I've been speaking with families, with educators, with students, with counselors, and school psychologists. I tell you right now, it's really tough for parents because they're trying to balance, you mentioned that, balance for those fortunate to be able to work at home, balance with remote learning for their children. It's stressful. And yesterday I spoke with an educator here in Northwest Oregon about what might happen over the next couple of weeks with the schools preparing to open. She said they're terrified. It is just a time when there is so much uncertainty We know that districts and schools were getting technology out to, and you mentioned, I was so impressed with how educators stepped up and moved to remote learning quite rapidly. But we know that a lot of students are just not connecting. I spoke with some counselors who said, we're losing track of students we need to keep in touch with. So this is really about equity. And with that equity lens and the concern about making sure that all of our public education, all of our schools, all of our students have access to safe, quality public education, we need to talk about how we reopen schools based on science, based on local conditions, based on public health guidance, and not on politics or fear of risking federal dollars. I was very critical of the administration for threatening to take away federal dollars from schools if they don't open on the Trump administration's timeframe. They don't get to decide when schools open. Also the comment that the guidelines are flexible, that doesn't work. So we know we need significant investment. We know that, and there was some already, but we know there is more that's needed to make sure that our schools and our school districts have what they need to provide that safety, that equity to the students, but also keep everyone in the school safe. There are educators and staff there too. So we know with the investment that was made in the CARES Act, we know that's not enough. The House passed the HEROES Act, which is a good amount of money, but the Senate hasn't acted yet. So it was $13 billion in the CARES Act. HEROES is $915 billion for state and local governments, which is critical because so much of school funding comes from state and local governments and their revenue is way down. So we need to fill those gaps. And we do that in the HEROES Act, which the House passed again in May, with an additional $58 billion investment in K-12 schools. That's in addition to the $915 billion. So those investments are important. We need also to know that school meals are important. And I've co-sponsored along with Chairman Scott from the Education and Labor Committee, the Pandemic Child Hunger Prevention Act. I hope we can get this through because we know how important it is for students to have good nutrition. This will allow all children to access breakfast, lunch, and dinner and after school snacks, either in school or grab and go delivery options, depending on how the school is providing education. This is especially important now that schools are struggling. So we need those resources to fill the gap from state and local funding, but also to provide that additional funding specifically for K-12 education so our schools can do what they need to do to keep our educators and our students and the staff safe. And again, this needs to be based on science. It needs to be based on recommendations of our healthcare providers and on local conditions and be made at the local level. Providers and on local conditions and be made at the local level.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bonamici. And you mentioned that, frankly, it costs money. We need real federal dollars invested, and I appreciated you're actually putting some dollar figures out there about what needs to happen. Can you say a little bit more about what sorts of investments, what those investments would cover in terms of the kinds of safety measures? We know that schools are workplaces where, and you just said this, we should not be asking educators to put their lives on the line to teach our kids. It is unfair and it is unjust.
Absolutely. Well, when we're looking at the health and safety of students, teachers, staff, and families, making that a priority, we need to respond. In fact, this is true for all workers. We need to have some workplace protections and some standards in place. We know that reopening needs to incorporate the feedback of educators and families and students and staff. And get their input. Again, I was talking to an educator yesterday who was telling me about one of the plans where they had, of course, we need the physical distancing. And she said once they had the classroom taped off to show, there was no place for the teacher to be because every space was was there for spreading students out. So we need to get that input, have those protections, have the physical distancing. I don't say social distancing, it was physical distancing between students, but we also need more PPE, that personal protective equipment. We don't have enough right now. We need sanitation supplies to make sure that the schools can stay safe. And then we need to have flexibility for staff, for educators and staff who are at high risk. If they are sick or if they have been exposed, they need to be able to stay home without fear of consequence. So we need to have those protections for our workers. There's a COVID-19 Every Worker Protection Act that will help establish these standards to keep workers safe. We included that in the HEROES Act with additional funding for OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, because without standards, we won't have the confidence that we need to send our students and educators and staff back into our schools. And I want to say, that Donald Trump said that coronavirus is just going to go away. It's not. He said that children are almost immune. They're not. And I can't imagine what it must feel like to be a parent who lost a child to COVID-19 and hear that comment. Our students are not guinea pigs. We need to make sure that they are safe when they go back to school. Of course, we all want schools to open. We know that our public education system is there to provide learning opportunities for all. I share the concerns of so many who are worried about the disruption in learning because of the pandemic. But the worst thing we can do is to send students and staff in when they are not sure they're going to be safe. So all of those are important protections. And then there's something else too that I need to mention, and that's childcare. Our childcare system was already struggling before the pandemic. Every county in Oregon was a childcare desert, and that's true in many places across the country. One slot for every 3 kids who need care. And importantly, it's too expensive when families can find it. And the people who work in childcare often make wages that are so low, they can't afford childcare for their own families. We absolutely need to fix the childcare system and support it, because without childcare, there will be no economic recovery. We know a lot of educators are parents as well. And if they can't go back to work without confidence that their children have a safe place to be, we won't be able to have our schools and our economy fully open. So I'm pleased to report that the House has recently passed the Child Care is Essential Act, a $50 billion investment, which I note is less than we paid to support the airlines. And these are our children at stake, that will go to our childcare providers to make sure their facilities are safe and to raise the wages of the people who are working, doing this really important work of taking care of the next generation. And I tell you, this is a good investment. Investing in our youth in high quality early childhood education prepares them then to be ready when they enter the K-12 system. So it's a very good investment. And then one more thing I want to mention in addition is, as you talked about, Liz, the infrastructure, the school buildings. Many schools were already struggling, falling down, lead in the water. They don't have good HVAC systems. So we have the Reopen and Rebuild American Schools Act that we actually passed in the House as part of our big Moving Forward Infrastructure Act. What a message it would send to our students and our families if we can get this infrastructure, school infrastructure done and make our schools safe places for everyone, even more important now with coronavirus. So all of those pieces are important to making sure that our schools are safe and healthy for everyone who's learning and working in them.
Congresswoman Bonamici, thank you so much for lifting up so many, different solutions. It's not, there isn't sort of a single solution to this crisis. There are a lot of different pieces that we need to move at once. And I know you have been, absolutely a champion, long before the coronavirus crisis hit, but a champion for addressing the inequities in our school system and for lifting up the childcare workforce and the need to assist parents with being able to afford high quality childcare. So,
Absolutely.
just I want to just mention one of the particularly galling things that I heard about kids, and the idea of sending kids back to school no matter what the conditions were was the notion when Betsy DeVos said that our children are stoppers of COVID-19. My children will not be used as stoppers. Thank you. So that's just my public service.
No, absolutely.
Does
We
not
need
work,
these
and I
decisions to be based on science, not science fiction. So,
exactly.
when we look at Liz and everyone, we look at the legislation that the House has passed, from the HEROES Act to rebuild America's schools, and we're working on the pandemic child hunger bill. All of these things can create a better future, and that's what we want for our children and grandchildren. We want to create a better future for them. And I just want to reiterate what a good investment it is. This is the United States of America. I mean, look at the places where they've tried to open up too soon, like you mentioned in Indiana, and we see serious problems. It's not that we don't have the resources, it's a matter of priorities. Our children, our public school system, our educators, those need to be priorities for a better future for everyone.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation
Happy
tonight.
to. Thank you.
We'd love to, if you're able to, have you stay on, and there's going to be some Q&A if you have to hop at some point.
I'm happy to stay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now I am thrilled to introduce our next speaker. It's so wonderful to have you here with us, President Lily Eskelen Garcia. President Eskelen Garcia is the president of the National Education Association, the nation's largest labor union. President Eskelen Garcia began her career in education, as she likes to say, as a school lunch lady, and now leads a professional association of 3 million educators. So that is a really large union, and has been leading the charge on plans around safety and health and school reopening and bringing educators' voices to the table. President Eskelen Garcia is the first Latina to lead the NEA and one of the country's most influential Hispanic educators. The NEA has been working so hard to ensure that students and educators are safe as schools begin to reopen. And President Eskelen Garcia, I'm wondering if you ever sleep. I'm seeing you everywhere, fighting for our teachers and fighting for our kids. I'm so thrilled to have you join us because of the work that you are doing and leading, and because of the importance of listening to educators' advice when it comes to school reopening. So we know that there is a union advantage on safety and health, that unionized workplaces are safer workplaces, and schools are no exception to that. But this is only true if we listen to our unions. And so we are going to be listening to President Eskelen Garcia here tonight. And thank you so much for being here to share your insight. So President Eskelen Garcia, here's a question I have for you. We know that our educators and all school personnel are now facing impossible choices. How do they do the work that they love, serving our students, without putting themselves and their families and often their students at risk? We know we have plenty of teachers who are in high risk categories who really have to worry about real serious threats to their lives as we have these school reopening conversations. I'd love to hear from you what you're hearing from your members.
And I appreciate that lovely introduction. My first job in a school was lunch lady. I was a teacher, and a really, really good sixth grade teacher. You would want your 12-year-old in my class, and this would be my favorite time of year. And I'd be putting up bulletin boards and figuring out desks, which I switched around every week. And we're not doing that this year. We are not having fun with Zoom classes. Parents are at the end of their rope. We're trying to connect with kids. For a lot of our kids, teaching and learning never stopped when the school doors closed. We just started switching to, all right, how do we connect with our kids? We want to go back. We want to go back to in-school classes when and where we can do it so nobody dies. And yes, when Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos flippantly say, oh, kids can't be, no, don't even worry about it. They never say a word about the teachers or the lunch ladies or the school custodian or the assistant vice principal. They never say a word about the adults, the village it takes in that building. And they're dead wrong about kids not being at risk. If you have a child with asthma, your child is in a high risk category. That's a lot of kids out there. And we know who's likely in a family not to be able to afford daycare, private daycare for their kids. Who takes care of the kids when mom or dad's at work? Sometimes la abuelita, the grandma, and the family of older folks, aunts and uncles, were those kids, and we know those kids can be spreaders. A kid coughs at the back of my room, and I had 39 sixth graders one year. 39 sixth graders, not a fun year for me, and not a healthy year pre-pandemic. But if a kid coughed, I knew I was going to get 3 kids' colds every year. I knew it. I signed up for it. I get it. Now a kid coughs at the back of the room, and I end up in the ICU. A kid coughs on his friend, and that friend goes home and hugs grandma. People can die. It's a pandemic. Look at the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have died, millions now, who are infected. And one of the number one questions we're getting from our members, these are the family of educators, teachers, librarians, the school nurse, the school secretary, the custodians and lunch ladies, all of the folks that it takes to serve those kids. They're asking us if we have wills, like forms that we can send them. They're making out their last will and testament instead of putting up bulletin boards. School districts are actually putting together standardized protocols for when the next teacher or student dies from COVID. You want to talk about trauma? Talk about a teacher who doesn't come back to school. And we are absolutely worried about our kids falling behind. I do a lot of media, and some reporter will say, but aren't you worried? You know, like you need to go back to school because aren't you worried about the kids falling behind academically? Aren't you worried about their social, emotional health? I'll tell you what we're worried about, because we're worried about all of the above, and we don't want a child to die. Reading and writing and arithmetic? Yeah. Social, emotional development? You bet. Health and safety gets sacrificed in a global pandemic so kids don't fall behind. It is impossible to talk to some folks about what's at stake. So it's life and it's death. And because of that, let me just say very clearly, and I'll go back to you, Liz, that under no circumstances should anyone be taking medical advice from Donald Trump or Betsy DeVos. That is not going to end well for children or other living things. So please listen to me when it comes to getting your kid to love reading and not be able to put their homework down. Your kids will do well. In my classroom, I am an education professional. I am not an infectious disease expert. I know what I know, and I know what I have to depend on other people to teach me. And so we're listening to those medical experts. And the first thing they're saying is no community should even think about in-person classes if they are surging in their infection rate. all of those countries that Donald Trump threw out, oh, what about Denmark and Germany and Norway? They opened their schools. Yeah, when the infection rate was declining and had been reduced to a very controllable level. And then they didn't throw the doors open. They said, all right, now, because there's still a small percentage of infection out there, it's controlled. But now we only open with plans to distance, disinfect, do the health screenings, have the face masks, have what you need. The hardest thing is distancing, split sessions, use of space. We can be pretty creative. We can help solve some of these problems. But now, with the virus surging all over this country, how in the world do you look a parent in the eye and say, we're going to open the doors, you're going to put your kids back in Miss Eskelsen's classroom, 39 of them are going to sit there. And we're kind of sort of hoping that nothing bad happens. You will turn that school into a super spreader. Those kids will take it back to their homes. They will infect teachers. Teachers will infect other teachers. We're members of the community. All of us are at risk for having this and not having symptoms. People will die if we do this wrong. People have died in places like Arizona where they did it wrong, where they listened to a politician instead of a doctor, instead of a teacher. We're not going to let this happen. And we are going to do whatever it takes to keep our students and their families safe, to keep us and our families safe, because that's the way you protect the entire community.
I think we owe you all at the NEA a big debt of gratitude for fighting for our kids and their teachers to stay safe, because you're right that what we are talking about right now is life and death. And of course, as a parent, I care about social emotional and I care about my kids' academic achievement, but you know what I really care about? I care about keeping my kids and their teachers alive. And it's not theoretical at all. I mean, as you pointed out, people have died. And I remember reading it just made the tears just flow down my face, an article about the New York City school personnel who died right at the start of the COVID pandemic before New York City shut down schools. And dozens and dozens of school personnel lost their lives because of the pandemic. And this is what we will see again if we are not careful and prudent in the way that we reopen. So, I mean, those are the stakes, life and death. And I just am so glad that, NEA is really out there fighting for our kids and for their beloved teachers. I think it would be really wonderful to hear President Eskelen Garcia. We heard from Congresswoman Bonamici about, some of the funding that they're trying to get through Congress to support our schools. What do you need in the way of support from Congress?
I give all praise and thank you for the HEROES Act. Please send us some heroes, please. And who didn't notice that when it went to the Senate, that the Senate jumped up and went right to vacation. They went on, you can't make this up. They went on vacation as if, so right now, the Senate is, and Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos and all those people that said, it's a hoax, don't worry about it, it's okay, kids are immune. The ones that raced, and by the way, we supported the help that went to businesses and to workers. We supported that. But I noticed it took like 15 minutes for them to go, the business community needs some help. And there it was. Public schools, public services need some help. Well, now let's talk about that. There is no way that any district could have predicted this. No one in the universe predicted this. So someone that said, well, your local government, your school district, they should have been putting money away for a pandemic that closed down no, nobody knew that this was going to happen. There is no budget for the disinfectants, for the masks, for spacing kids. That's going to we're going to need some paraprofessionals. We're going to need all hands on deck. We're going to need that school nurse, that school librarian, that school secretary. Everybody is going to have a specialized job to make sure in that lovely, wonderful day when the infection rate is low enough, they're going to have their plan ready. And it's going to cost a lot of money at a time when local and state government revenue has fallen off a cliff. And so for Mitch McConnell to go on vacation, for right now, for him to be absent without a permission slip and leave this to Donald Trump, inject yourself with disinfectant. Donald Trump is going to be talking about what schools need. And what did he say the other day? Here's what I care about, and I don't care about anything else. Well, schools were part of that. I don't care about anything else. So I'm a little exercised over that. And I see my friend John King on here, so I know he's going to get exercised because we know which kids need that public school the most. We know which parents and which families and which communities can say, let's all pitch in and get our own little pod teacher, and our kids can be taken care of. And we know which kids don't have mom and dad in the home to supervise them because they are in the service industry. I have teachers that know the names of kids when it's like we were trying to figure out virtual learning with families where the technology in the home was mom's cell phone. And she had to take it to work with her because she was an essential worker stocking shelves in a grocery store. We know which kids they don't care about. They should have been rushing those heroes straight to us. If they passed it tomorrow, it wouldn't be in time to open the thousands and thousands of schools that needed it yesterday, that needed it last week. They have put these kids on a shameless pause as if we could do that. So we need everything. We need the technology and the broadband for families that can't afford it. We need the services and the instruction for our students. And if it's not safe in that classroom, and the vast majority of schools, the community is not safe enough to open the doors of that school building. But teaching and learning and services must continue for our kids, especially those whose parents cannot afford to fill in the gap. For so many of our kids, that school nurse is their primary care physician. So how are we going to make sure that they get what they need? We can be pretty creative, but we are mad as hell that once again, we have been left holding the bag to figure this out. Now, I will end with this. I said some bad words. I'm so sorry. It just came out. For a reporter who looked at me and said, okay, Lily, so we know that the Senate's not really doing something. We know that Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump said, we're not sending you any help at all. We know that you're not going to get what you need from politicians. And then asked this question. So teacher, what are teachers doing about that? What's the plan that teachers have to make sure that those kids are safe when they put them in an unsafe building? What is your plan, Lily? I don't have a plan. You cannot fix stupid. These people have been complete idiots from day one in saying, we're not even going to acknowledge that we have a problem. We're not going to fix this infection. It'll go away on its own. So they've made stupid decision after stupid decision. And here we are, ready for the first day of school. And a reporter has the gall to ask teachers, so what are you going to do to make sure our kids are safe? we do not have a plan to fix the incredible, tragic response from so many leaders who should have known better. And they would have known better if they had listened to the professionals that know what our kids need and know how to keep communities safe. So we are going to insist and join forces with parents and advocacy groups and say, you will demand. We, as a learning community, that school community, grandmas and grandpas, we demand that our kids and families and communities and educators are not sacrificed for some political agenda because somebody wants their jobs numbers up. And so that's my plan, is that we won't put kids and teachers and families and communities in jeopardy. Not that I feel real strongly about it. Thank you for putting up with me.
We are so lucky in this time in which leadership is so badly needed through this crisis to have your leadership. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And yes, it's time for educators and parents and all those who want to keep our communities in safe to stand together. So thank you. And I know you have to jump. I heard you have another event because you don't sleep. So we're so grateful for you joining us. Next, I'm really honored in this time in which we need to have leaders who are going to put our kids and educators first, to welcome the former Secretary of Education, John King, here with us tonight. So John King is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. He served in President Obama's cabinet as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. Before becoming Education Secretary, he carried out the duties of the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education, and he oversaw all policies and programs related to K through 12 education, English learners, special education, and innovation. He began his career in education as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and in Boston, Massachusetts, and as a middle school principal. So we are so lucky to have you joining us tonight to lend your expertise at a time when we really need to be listening to the experts. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Mr. King.
Thanks for the opportunity to join you, Liz.
Absolutely. Our children are experiencing the trauma of this pandemic along with the rest of us. And you are someone who has fought for equity in education your entire career. We know that there are many kids who are really struggling and falling behind, who have already been left behind by our education system long before this crisis. We know that there are kids who are facing particular challenges, as President Eskelen Garcia said, whose parents are working in often low-wage jobs outside the home as essential workers, whose families are facing financial upheaval because they've lost their jobs. And there are kids who are dealing with the grief of having lost loved ones to this terrible pandemic, which we know has disproportionately stolen the lives out of Black and Brown families. So what we'd like to ask you tonight is, whether in person or virtually, what are your recommendations for schools who are working to ensure that every single child stays healthy and is supported by their schools?
Yeah. Well, first, Liz, it's important to say it didn't have to be this way, right? That the current administration, the Trump administration, has handled this pandemic disastrously, that we don't have rapid results testing, that we don't have contact tracing, that we don't have ways to support people to quarantine effectively, that we don't have broad compliance with public health guidance. That's why we're in this situation. This is not a school's problem, this is a society problem that is being visited on school. But in that context, educators, we love our students and want to figure out how to support our students. We need help from Congress. As Congresswoman Bonamici said, we need help on stabilizing school district budgets and funding for safe reopening. We need funding for internet access. We need funding for counselors and mental health services. We need funding to address learning loss. But again, at the end of the day, in schools, we want to try to support our kids. Where I'd start is with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Kids who are hungry can't learn. And so we've got to pay close attention to the fact that we've got 14 million kids who are food insecure. Recent surveys showed 40% of Black and Latino families are struggling to reliably put food in front of their kids. So one of the things schools need to do is figure out, how do we make sure that kids are getting meals? We know we have nearly 30 million kids who rely on the school meals program to get meals. So whether classes are happening in person or not, we still have to, as educators, figure out how we get food to our kids. And then we got to think about kids' socio-emotional well-being. As you mentioned, there are kids who have had the health consequences of COVID-19 affect their homes and families, lost loved ones. There are kids who've had the economic consequences of COVID-19 affect their families, lost employment, lost income. There are also kids who are in homes where there's addiction, where there's domestic violence, where there's abuse. And my heart breaks for the kids for whom school was the one safe place, and now they've been without that. I was a kid. My mom passed when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The only reason I am alive today is New York City public school teachers who saved my life, who made school a place that was safe and nurturing and supportive. And kids are without that now. Kids have been without that for months. And in many communities, because of how badly the administration has handled the pandemic, kids will be without that in this school year. So schools have got to figure out how to create relationships for kids. I think about the Phoenix Union School District in Arizona that has an Every Student Every Day campaign, where at least one adult in the school district is in touch with every kid every day to ask, what do you need? Are you hungry? Do you need a Wi-Fi hotspot? Do you need academic support? Do you need access to a counselor? Do you need telemental health services? And they are trying to make sure that every kid is connected to an adult with the school district so that they can support kids' socio-emotional well-being.
Wow, that's amazing. It is really incredible how a lot of school districts are stepping up and finding a way where there's no way in terms of supporting our kids. Could you talk a little bit about, and you mentioned kids who are struggling and who were being underserved in their school districts before this pandemic because of the lack of funding and inequities in education. Can you talk a little bit about how, when we think about racial justice and economic justice, how we apply those principles in this moment and what it looks like to actually have a school reopening policy that really centers racial and economic justice?
Yeah. Well, we have to acknowledge we really have two pandemics, right? We have the pandemic of COVID-19, and then we have a pandemic of systemic racism that has been with us since the beginning of the country. And of course, the result of those twin pandemics is sadly, tragically, unjustly, disparate impact on kids and families of color. So we know, for example, that 79% of white families have reliable access to the internet. Only 66% of Black families, only 61% of Latino families. So in school districts where learning is happening through distance or hybrid, the schoolhouse door is barred for kids because they don't have internet access. We've got to solve that in the wealthiest country in the world. We can solve that, just like in the New Deal. We made sure that we have the Tennessee Valley Authority and we got folks electricity. Today, the equivalent is we got to make sure that kids and families have internet access. We know that students of color are disproportionately in school districts that are under-resourced, that were under-resourced before COVID-19. We've got to get those districts additional resources so they can provide support for their teachers' professional development. They can help their teachers address students' learning needs so they have the counselors and mental health services that kids need. And then we've got to hold everybody. I believe we have to hold everybody to the words of the pledges of solidarity that so many institutions made. Whether it's corporations, foundations, higher ed institutions, school districts, almost everybody issued a statement saying, we believe Black Lives Matter, we stand with the protesters. Well, this is the moment to show that. If you mean that, then your curriculum has to have windows and mirrors. Kids of color have to have opportunities to read authors of color. They have to see characters of color. And white kids need that too. They need to see that diversity in the curriculum. If you mean those words in the statements of solidarity, then we have to address the issue of staff diversity. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. We know from the research evidence for a Black student having one Black teacher while in elementary school increases their likelihood of graduating from high school and going on to college. So we have to work to recruit and retain teachers and principals of color. Again, important for kids of color and important for white kids to see leaders of color in their classrooms and communities. If we mean the words in the statements of solidarity, we have to dismantle discipline policies that have a disparate impact on kids of color that result in them experiencing exclusionary discipline. We have more than 15 states where there's corporal punishment, state-sanctioned violence in schools against kids. Right? There's no way to justify that in the context where we truly value Black lives. And so this is a moment where we've got to match the reality to the rhetoric, the doing to the saying. I hope that will happen. Certainly at the Education Trust, we see our job as holding folks to that. And we all have a moral responsibility. We have a moral responsibility to address both pandemics, COVID-19 and systemic racism.
Thank you so much, Mr. King, for the work that you're doing to make sure that we are addressing the educational needs of all students, and that, you know, that we are making sure that people live up to their words, right, and their pledges. And the information and resources and research that Ed Trust brings to the table really helps ensure that policymakers are making the best decisions with the best evidence. And that's what we want. And we're so grateful to you and your terrific team for the work that you do every day. So I know this is an incredibly hard time in the space that you occupy, and we're just so grateful for all that you do. I want to turn now. Oh, first, I'm supposed to make PSA. I am told that we have a link which will be appearing soon on your screen, or may already be there, that you can click to share your thoughts with us. And I know that for many of you, this is deeply personal. However you're coming into this conversation. And this may frankly be, if you're a parent, if you're an educator, you may go to bed thinking about this and wake up thinking about this every day, right? And so we want to hear from you. We want to hear about what you're thinking, what your concerns are, what's happening in your district. Please share your thoughts with us. And now it is really my delight and honor to introduce Beatriz Beckford from Moms Rising. Beatrice is the National Director of Moms Rising. She has an MA in Women's and Gender Studies from Loyola University and brings 15 years of grassroots and national organizing experience and a noted track record of experienced grassroots leadership, organizing to create a movement for social change. Beatrice is a co-founder of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance and was co-founder and inaugural director of organizing and policy initiatives at the Brooklyn Food Coalition. And Beatrice has worked tirelessly with community members to build strong coalitions and develop strong grassroots leadership. And after hearing about all these esteemed roles, I want to tell you that her proudest role is as mama to a beautifully brilliant 11-year-old and a sweet and sassy 4-year-old, more power to you, who both remind her to love out loud, laugh often, to share, and to resist. So Beatrice, first, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And first of all, I want to ask how you and your family are doing. And I also want to ask you to share a little bit with us tonight. I know you are an amazing advocate and organizer, but about how this is personally affecting your family as well.
Yeah, Liz, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be amongst the esteemed guests. You'll be happy to know that I actually had a shower today. This is a clean shirt and I do have pants on. They're not leggings, not sweatpants, they are actual pants. So today's going very well. Thank goodness the kids are enjoying a movie thanks to TV and Netflix and all that good stuff. And so I'm able to join you uninterrupted, although you may hear a bang or somebody may enter. And so I apologize in advance for that. But I think there's a lot of weightedness that's come up in this conversation. And I think that weightedness and all the different things that are coming up and how this issue intersects in our lives is the weight that parents and caregivers feel each and every day. And so thank you for having me. It has been a struggle. And as you said earlier, while I feel as though my family has been blessed, I am working and able to provide for my family. I know that that is not the case for many parents and caregivers across the country, including many of our Moms Rising members who share their stories with us each and every day. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I also got a shower today, very proud.
The shower is a sign of
TMI. Yeah. It's, you know, it's a moment. Let's
it's
say
a thing.
sure.
It's a thing for many of us.
Yeah. You have spent your career fighting for young people, fighting for racial justice, including work to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. So I am hoping we can have a conversation about, in the context of what is really a much needed nationwide reckoning around structural racism in a pandemic that has hit Black and Brown communities terribly hard. And led to the loss of so many Black and Brown lives. How are you thinking about racial justice, and how are you thinking about school reopening, both in your role in your mama hat and your hat as an advocate?
Yeah, well, lucky for all of us, my mama hat is my racial justice hat. As a Black mother, I am always, even prior to the pandemic, worried about the quality of education and the way that my children are engaged in the school setting and outside of the school setting. In my professional work, obviously, working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline as early as in the preschool setting, collaborating with our early learning team, all the way through the end point of that, which is unfortunately youth incarceration in a country that incarcerates more young people than any other nation. It's critically important that we acknowledge that there were fractures in this system well before the pandemic hit. And I think many of our speakers have spoken to that so beautifully prior to then. One of the most troubling stories that I heard recently and that we were able to support some organizing on was the story of a young lady who was given the pseudonym Grace. Folk may have heard the Free Grace campaign out of Michigan, which is a young African-American girl, 15 years of age, who was an IEP student, who had communicated prior to both her probation person, her caseworker, that she was struggling to shift to remote learning, right? Her IEP mandates that she has somebody that works directly with her. And that communication that she provided actually ended up with her being criminalized and ultimately sentenced to a youth prison. And I feel like while her story is so endemic of all the ways in which the system kind of breaks and criminalizes Black and Brown young people, in a pandemic, we're seeing it happen even in more harsh ways, right? Where Black students, Black and Brown students, students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, Indigenous students are at risk of greater criminalization, even outside of the school building when they're expected to learn remotely without the tools that they are required to have through an IEP or should have by law with respect to accessing quality education. And so I think that as we, navigate all the different dynamics of a pandemic and what it means for our families and our children in the school building, that we not forget that there are ways in which we can be different in this and that we can be innovative and address some of the issues that we were facing well before the pandemic. And that includes many of the racial justice issues that our school districts faced. Luckily, because of all the different work that's happening with organizations across the country, many of whom are represented on the call, including Moms Rising, there are things that we can do to start to fund schools at the level they need to be funded, so that there isn't this increased dependency on criminalization and increased dependency on police in schools versus, counselors, nurses, I've been hearing from school nurses and school nurse associations that there's too many school districts that are having conversations about whether to open in the fall that are not even consulting with school nurses. This is appalling to have a readily available set of expertise with teachers, educators, medical professionals who all operate within the school building to provide better services and resources for the students so that they all can thrive within that building, and that we're missing key constituencies that can help to shape what a reopening looks like when it's safe and appropriate to do so for everybody, including teachers, staff, and students, and what to do in situations when it's not appropriate to do this so that e-learning and remote learning is accessible and doesn't continue to exacerbate a homework gap or a racial gap among students who we know have very limited access and whose families are dealing with a whole host of other issues. We can fix a lot of this stuff by calling on Congress to provide the funding to reopen schools and campuses by providing robust funding to support educators, staff, students during this pandemic. And this includes investing in our education system at least $175 billion to stabilize education funding, at least $4 billion to equip students with hotspots and devices to help narrow the digital divide and close the homework gap, and at least $56 million, as the representative was saying earlier, in direct funding for personal protective equipment, PPE, because we know this is important as well. I think, one of the things that was mentioned earlier that's really, really important to say, and I say it too as a mom, childcare is part of this solution. We cannot talk about education funding without talking about how we need to push the Senate to pass the Child Care Essential Act. $50 billion is not nearly enough. Let's just be clear. If we can give the private jet industry so much more, absolutely, we can give the people who care for our nation's children each and every day tirelessly well over $50 billion. This shouldn't even be a question. Parents are already having to juggle enough. Trying to get Washington to act in the best interest of their constituencies shouldn't be a battle that we have to engage in. And then in addition to that, ensuring that there's equity in our social safety net is an education issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's a childcare issue. It's a mama issue. And we need to make sure that funding that directly goes to schools and childcare facilities contribute to the social safety net as well, including expanding unemployment benefits, passing permanent paid leave, earned sick days, and extending and expanding nutrition programs like SNAP and PEBT, which replaced the school lunch program. Like, we have the solutions that will help support families and parents and moms and dads and caregivers at this time. And we really need Congress to act, because if we've learned anything in this pandemic is that, the ways of doing things in the past are long gone. We have to be innovative, and we have to understand that these issues are intersectional and intersect in ways that need to be resourced so that we can support the families, particularly those most vulnerable amongst us. And we can do this, and we need to continue to push Congress to act so that we get the supports that our families, particularly our vulnerable families, need. I'm based here in Chicago, and as many of you may know, Chicago Public Schools just announced that they will be doing entirely remote learning in the fall. A decision that I think was made respectfully with the support of the amazing CTU, continuing to push for and be staunch advocates for Chicago students and Chicago teachers. And so I respect the decision fully, and I also feel as though it's critically important for school districts like Chicago and San Diego and Los Angeles that are making the decisions to go remote to protect their teachers and students, as large school districts with a whole host of dynamics that could play out in a pandemic, be able to access resources at the federal level and not be restricted from those because they make the decision to follow the advice of professionals, medical professionals, and go remote. And I think that, as a parent, we don't want to have to be worrying about, whether the schools are going to have the resources they need, whether, the schools are going to have to decide whether to send one family a laptop or one kid a laptop, which is some of the questions that we're hearing here and from folks across the country. And so I hope that we can continue together as a community to push Congress to act on this and to push the Senate to make to pass the legislation that will help our students thrive and our families thrive, because that is the only way that our economy will thrive.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your advocacy for what we need in the way of supporting our educators and supporting our kids in this moment. You touched on a really important issue, which is the importance of equity in terms of making sure that all of our kids have internet access. And frankly, this is actually an issue that preceded the pandemic. I'm from Indiana, and in some places in rural Indiana, the way that kids do their homework is they go to the McDonald's, right? Because that's where there's internet access. And so the question is, can you get the car? Is dad or mom home from work early enough that you can get the car to go drive to McDonald's to do your homework? That is way too many steps for a kid to have to take to be able to get their homework done. And it was way too many steps before the pandemic. And so I want to turn it back for a second to Mr. King, because I think I noticed that you recently published an op-ed calling for a national policy on internet access. And what would it look like to have a national policy around access to the internet, which I think we frankly need to treat as the same as drinking water at this point? Could I turn that back to you, Mr. King, to answer that for a moment? Because
Sure.
it's important right now.
Sure. We have a program that already exists to help schools to provide internet access called E-Rate. That program ought to be expanded and funded at an appropriate level so that school districts can get internet service to all the kids who need it. There's a proposal from Senator Markey and Congresswoman Meng that would provide $4 billion to support expansion of the E-Rate program. The FCC could step in here and help by changing the rules around how the E-Rate program operates. And so we need to do that for K-12. There's a proposal for higher ed. Congresswoman Eshoo and Senator Klobuchar have a proposal for $1 billion focused on high needs higher education students, because we have community college students, for example, students at minority serving institutions who disproportionately don't have internet access. So this is solvable. Beyond that, because the internet is vital, not just for school, but it's vital to look for a job, it's vital to apply for benefits, we ought to have a national strategy around broad internet access. Again, that treats it like a utility, that says, just like you got to have electricity to participate in the 21st century economy, you got to have the internet to participate in the 21st century economy. And we have the resources as a country to make sure that happens. Instead, what's happening is we have communities where the cable company says you have an unpaid balance from a year ago, so you can't get the internet. That can't possibly be the right strategy in a moment when kids are at home, they have to get on the internet to learn.
Sorry, I'm so glad you're fighting for that policy. We need to treat the internet right now as a public utility. We needed to do it before, and we're behind, and we need to do it immediately. Congresswoman Bonamici, I'm going to turn the next question to you. We have a question coming from Oregon, from Betsy, who would like to hear about what schools can do to serve special needs kids in this pandemic. And I will add, it would be wonderful if you could talk to us about what the rights are of kids who have special needs in this pandemic, and how we can make sure that their needs are being met, and which is, very difficult, often in a virtual environment, and something that I know so many schools are stepping up to the plate to do. But it would be wonderful, Congresswoman Bonamici, if you could talk a little bit about the framework around that.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Betsy, for that question. It is particularly challenging for so many students during the pandemic. It's one of those areas, again, where the pandemic has exacerbated already existing issues. We know, for example, that the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, has never been fully funded. And so with that lack of funding to begin with, and then with the needs, it does make it even more challenging. And we certainly need to work with our educators, our special ed educators, our districts, to find out what they are doing. And I've spoken with some educators and counselors who said they're trying to reach out to make sure they can meet the needs. But we also have here in Northwest Oregon the same challenge we were just talking about. Not everyone has connectivity. And so even losing the ability to connect because you don't have internet is a challenge. And I know some of the districts are trying to work out deals with some of the companies to provide internet, and it's ostensibly free, but then if they go over a limit, then they start getting charged. So we have to be really careful about that as well. I'm happy to report that there is some bipartisan support for rural broadband and making sure that we have broadband access. But the needs of all of our students need to get met, especially the students with special needs. And it is, I'm not saying I have an answer for you exactly, but I know that if we have that funding, if we have the IDEA funding, if we have the K-12 funding, if we are making decisions based on science and what's best for our students and what's best for our educators, that is going to be what's best for every student, including students with special needs. And we can't make exceptions and say, well, some students we're going to take the risk and bring them in, even though they may benefit more from being in an actual classroom rather than remote. So it just calls on us even more to help fill some of these equity gaps. I was really glad to hear Beatrice talk about some of those, as well as Secretary King. And I think I want to add here that both Chairman Bobby Scott, of the chairman of the Education Labor Committee, and I are so committed to addressing these equity gaps, particularly in the K-12 system, but even starting with Black maternal health disparities. Those exist and need to be addressed. I mentioned earlier the importance of investing in high quality early childhood education, which then reduces costs in the K-12 system going forward. So all of these are issues that we are looking at, and we really do need to take, it's been a really challenging time, and you can hear it in people's voices, and especially now with the stress that families are going through, and they don't know what's going to happen. And you know, those fortunate enough to have a job and be able to work at home are trying to balance that, but too many are either out of a job, some still don't have their unemployment. Thank you for mentioning that too, Beatrice. We need to look at this crisis as an opportunity, because as we are starting to reopen our schools safely, we can address the equity issues. We can address the infrastructure issues. We talk about infrastructure, that's broadband, that's buildings, to make sure our school buildings are safe. And that every school has clean air and clean water. And all of these things will help fill those gaps, because we know that the schools in the nicer areas, they're beautiful schools in the district I represent, because they're wealthier areas where people can pass bonds and levies and build new beautiful buildings, but there are also areas where the schools are in desperate need of rebuilding. We have to take that equity lens and say, every student deserves to be in a safe and healthy school. So I know that was a long answer, but I really wanted to respond to some of the things that Secretary King and Beatrice and Lily Garcia brought up as well. So thank you for your question. Again, it's a real challenge that has been even more highlighted by the pandemic. So I appreciate that. Thanks. Oh, and I also want to add because Beatrice brought up the childcare, the childcare is essential bill. It's $50 billion to start, but it's an additional $50 billion for long term. So we know there's short term immediate needs during the pandemic, but childcare was a crisis even before the pandemic. And just also repeat that this is a good investment when we invest in high quality, not just parking kids somewhere, but high quality early childhood education. It is such a good use of our resources. It is worth every penny. Our students are worth it. Our children are worth it. And it's what we need to do to create a better future. Thanks.
Sorry, my dog likes to bark his way through these things, so I had you all muted for a moment. Thank you, Congresswoman Bonamici, and thank you, Secretary King, and thank you so much to Beatriz Beckford. I think one of the things that all of you pointed out in a through line of all of your comments, as well as President Eskelen Garcia's comments, right, is that the solutions are there if we are willing to make the investments that we need. And Beatrice, I so appreciated that you made the connection to the need to solve a lot of disparities that existed before this pandemic. The school to prison pipeline that we discussed. I appreciated that you made the connection to things outside the education space that are going to be critical to keep our kids safe. Unemployment benefits, the lifeline that we need to ensure that families can continue to receive at a livable benefit level in order to make sure that kids don't go hungry like we know so many are right now in the United States. I mean, it's harrowing to think about what families are going through, and I know that there are solutions on the table. There are solutions that we've seen in the HEROES Act, and we really need action. So I want to thank all of you for the insights that you've brought here tonight. We went 17 minutes over because honestly, there was no way that I was going to stop this important conversation. I know we have listeners, as I said, for whom this is just a personal issue that they're living every single day in their communities. And our number one priority, right, has to be to keep our communities safe. And we need solutions that are going to do that. And that's what we're here to do. It is so refreshing to have a conversation where the facts and evidence come first. So thank you all so much for leading that. Thank you for leading the charge and for everything that you bring to this really just critical issue. Here we are, it's back to school time. We need a plan, and we need to see from our administration a national plan. We know this pandemic doesn't know borders of cities or states, right? We need to have a plan that actually keeps our educators, keeps our kids, keeps our families safe. So thank you all for being a part of pressing for those solutions. And thank you to the wonderful folks who've been with us here tonight. Special shout out to the CPC Center team that is so terrific and puts on these programs every week. You are phenomenal. Jess, Parker, Hiba, often with an assist from Kenton, Bamala. Thank you so much for all that you do. And thank you to the act.tv folks who are here live streaming this everywhere. So we appreciate all of you. I wish you all health and safety, and we will continue to be together in this fight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.